Hello, welcome to Write Volumes One Question. This is where we ask our writers one question, then share their thoughts on the subject and how it affects them in their writing. My name is Janaea. I'm one of the editors and founders of Write Volumes. Our goal is to give diverse voices an outlet for expression and to bring attention to diverse writers and our thoughts. In this one question series, we may not discover the right answers. There may not be right answers, but there are right discussions. The goal is to stimulate conversation, voice potentially alternate perspectives, provide a glimpse of how others view the world, and to expand ideas. Please remember, while we are a range of people on this panel, we are individuals and not a spokesperson for a race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or anything. We speak for ourselves and not on behalf of everyone in our tribes or community. People are not stereotypes. We have a voice, and we are our own voice. It seems like society's current process is very adversarial. Us against them, right versus wrong, good versus evil. It's a coin approach, one side versus another. I view people and the world as in constant motion. I'm capable of having more than one side, more than one emotion at a time. I can embody contradictions. The world is large enough to contain multitudes. We all exist. The world is not static, even with its cyclical nature of day, night, and seasons. There's still variations. Since the world is not static, so why should people be static? Why should we be limited? People are rarely one thing too, and as the world evolves, so can the mind and so can the heart. Thinking and feeling can be a muscle. If we don't exercise them, they won't grow. This series is to help color the world beyond the black and white, beyond the coin approach. This is to allow for shades of people. Some of the questions in this series stems from biases I discovered in my writing or reading habits and thought would be interesting to discuss with fellow writers to learn more about writing, storytelling, other people, about everything really. Let's listen, let's think, let's feel, let's ask, let's share, let's talk. Here's one question for today. And it's a special one question because it's more of like a book record. So the one question is, who is your favorite writer or book in the community you identify with, and what in it captured your attention? So we have a panel of writers. What we'll do is have each panelist state their thoughts in 2 to 3 minutes max. Then we'll discuss it together as a group, ask each other questions or make comments. Let me introduce you to the panel for today. We have Karen Brailsford. She is the author of Sacred Landscapes of the Soul, Aligning with the Divine Wherever You Are by Wyatt Mackenzie, and its release date is September of 2020, exciting. A native New Yorker and Yale graduate, she is a licensed spiritual therapist with the Agape International Spiritual Center in Los Angeles. She is author of Shades of Love and Shades of Horror and Strangeness, our anthology, Mommy Still Inherent in Me, and Shades of Transition and Transformation. Fannie Price enjoys creating stories that bring her hometown, Chicagoland, and other cities to life. Siren, in Shades of Horror and Strangeness, introduces Veronica Sykes prior to the Dragon Rider series debut novel, After the Flesh. Visit FanniePriceNovels.net for updates on her book releases, excerpts, free reads, and more. Randall Jon Van Vynckt. I think I probably butchered your name. Sorry, Randall. Specializes mostly in being unpublished. So he's delighted to have his fiction find a home in Write Volumes ebooks, Slow Dance in Shades of Horror and Strangeness, 14 Days and Valentine's Day in Shades of Transition and Transformation. He is a dozen years into the proverbial great American novel. In the past life, he published essays about historic places and wrote erotic fan fiction. Jocelyn Dominguez, or JoJo, is a graphic design graduate from Fort Hays State University, part-time writer and full-time artist. Her fictional short stories explore existential topics and characters that wander her mind. Author of Seen in Shades of Horror and Strangeness, Yellow Light and Knowing in Shades of Transition and Transformation. See more of her work at www.jocelyndominguez.com. So let's begin with Karen. What do you think? Who is your favorite writer? Oops, I should have, sorry. This is, now I'm sharing the screen with everybody's bio. So Karen, who is your favorite author or writer in the book or the name of the book in the community you identify with, and what is it that captured your attention?
Mm. So I selected the insightful and unique gem of a book called People Who Led to My Plays. And it was written by the brilliant avant-garde playwright Adrian Kennedy, who's best known for the work called Funny House of a Negro, which won an Obie in 1964. And so I love this book because it's filled with insights and memories and photographs and descriptions. It's really a scrapbook. And it's only 125 pages long. And I return to it again and again and again just for inspiration, because you really get to see how she evolved as a playwright, how she evolved as a writer. And so the book starts with her, it talks about her childhood, and then in the 30s and 40s, and then it goes up to when she moves to New York. So basically it's portrait of an artist as a young Black woman is what it is. So I wanted to share some of my favorite passages just because they're very short and they're very fun. So one of her influences, she says, was people in nursery rhymes. And then so she goes on to say, Humpty Dumpty, Jack Sprat, Little Bo Peep, people did illogical things that had a deeper, more puzzling meaning. And that's the end of, that entry. And then she goes on to talk about people in the Bible. And she summarizes that by saying, life was old. Or Billie Holiday, she sang in a sad way, I yearn to understand. And my favorite entry, I think, is about Lana Turner. It says, I kept reading that she was, quote, discovered in a drugstore. Being discovered seemed to be something necessary for happiness. Would I ever be discovered? And what could I do to even be considered? It really worried me. And then finally, there's a entry in which the topic is people my parents talked about. And I really related to this in my own writing just because of how influential my parents are in my writing in terms of what I write and what I remember. So she writes, looming very large were the people my parents talked about after they sent me outside to play. Sometimes I would at least hear part of their names, and when we'd go to church, I'd find myself staring at so-and-so who I knew had that first name. What had they done that made my mother whisper on the phone or caused me to be sent outside to play so it could be talked about? Often they'd say, no one really knows the truth, but people say. And so Adrian concludes that contradictory voices, different versions of a story as a way of penetrating to the truth of things would become important in my work. And I just love that and everything about the book because it's so succinct and it just speaks to me as a Black woman, but it speaks to me probably more importantly as an artist, as someone who's creating and who's drawing upon disparate memories to create what I create, whether it's fiction or nonfiction.
Wow. Okay, thank you. Fannie, who's yours?
So my inspiration came from a writer, L.A. Banks, and she is the author of a Vampire Hunter series, which is urban fantasy series. And I'll never forget the first time that I saw one of her books. I was actually standing in the Borders. Well, it's not a Borders anymore. It's now a Old Navy downtown on Wabash. And I was getting something for Christmas and I looked over to my left and I saw this cover with this Black woman on it and she had a sword and I'm like, could this be? So I picked it up and I saw, I saw the author's picture on the back. So I was like, okay, I have to get this because, that's my genre, that's my bag. And there's just not that many Black female characters in that particular, in urban fantasy genre. So I took it home and then I realized it was the third book in the series. So I immediately, found the first two and started reading those, and they were just amazing. They were these amazing stories told by someone who looked like me with a main character who looked like me that I could identify with. And she managed to bring in just this culturally diverse world that I just fell in love with. And from that point on, pretty much anyone who's, into the genre, or not even necessarily into the genre, and they're just looking for something to read, that's like my go-to now. I just, you know, it's one of those things that you can't say enough, and I don't want to sound like, you know, I'm the LA Bank spokeswoman, but not just her writing. I had the chance to meet her at a couple book signings, and you know, the spiritualness in her, and the realness of her, and just her willingness and openness to meet people and discuss life, everything, not just, you know, urban fantasy was the end, but she was just this amazing woman. And it's one of the people, I'm not one who, when celebrities or famous people die, I don't, you know, get worked up, because we don't know them. But she was one, when she passed away, I had a moment, because it was like this light was taken out of the world. But then part of me is thinking, well, we still have her work, and this is how we remember her. And she's actually the one who inspired me to seek publication. So for the longest time, I would write. I've been writing since I was in grade school. I have notebooks full of things that I used to write that no one will ever see. I will burn them before I die so that no one will ever read them. But after reading that, and it's like, you know what? If she can do this, it was my inspiration. It's like, well, maybe I do have a voice that other people are interested in hearing and want to read my stories. So since that, you know, that's really what inspired me to become a published writer, and not just a writer for myself and for my family.
Wow. Randall.
Yes. Okay. My author is, well, author and book is Garth Greenwell, author of a book called What Belongs to You. That was his first novel, and he's since written a follow-up novel called Cleanness. And so What Belongs to You, which was the original one. What's notable about his writing is it's almost like totally narrative, despite it mostly being about one-on-one interactions with people. In other words, he kind of like, rather than doing dialogue in quotes, he describes in narrative what the conversation is all about. And the amazing thing about him, what I find amazing about him, is that he writes in such a level of, you can almost call it clinical detail, that you read as he's narrating this conversation, you're reading how fluid the communication is in terms of how he's reading the other person, how he's projecting onto the other person, how he thinks the other person is responding to him, you know, and these are, so it's one side is his conclusions, but the other person is there, you know, and he goes and he uses initials. So he goes like, you know, so, oh, gee, I could tell I did the wrong thing because G, you know, leaned back in his seat, and I could tell he was distancing himself from me, or something like that. And so what it did is just really, it's kind of like, I don't know if I'd call it maybe like subtext written on the page almost, you know, because he's, you know, it's his self-awareness of everything. He is like hyper self-aware and hyper projecting. You know, so it's like the story is there, and the story is almost tangential, you know, around these scenes, these intimate scenes, and he does his community, I guess, if you will. He does happen to be, you know, a gay male, and his book What Belongs to You involves his relationship in Sofia, Bulgaria. Garth Greenwell, he doesn't identify himself that way in the book, but he taught at the American school there, high school. And it's his relationship with a basically male hustler. It's just very kind of emotionally intimate throughout. And I think it's just a great way to, you kind of really think about what people mean when they're talking to you, you know, what could be going on in their mind. And so I think it's just a real good way to think about when I'm writing like an intimate scene or something. And this is particularly interesting when you're in a scene of desire or sex. And he's very big on that. But, you know, just what's going on in his mind can be quite alarming and quite astonishing. So that's Garth Greenwell.
Thank you. Jojo, what about you?
Yeah, so my book recommendation is House of the Scorpion by Nancy Farmer. And she's actually won quite a bit of awards for this book. She originally wrote this book as a short story for an anthology that she decided to extend off and branch off into a novel. And I believe she also has made it into 2 different books, but I haven't read the second one. But this first one really stuck out to me personally, and it's always something that I think back to and I recollect quite fondly, even though it's a young adult novel, because it really, really enjoyed the way that she used language. It's the story about, she based it off of a story that she had while living in Arizona, encountering an immigrant crossing the border into the United States from Mexico, which is very, very relevant in my family as immigrants to this country myself. And her use of language almost seemed as if honestly she were a Spanish dual speaking person herself. I thought she was Hispanic the entire time I was reading it, and I admire her ability to be able to encompass the language, the mode of speaking, and it seemed so natural. And not only that, but I had never read a book that had actually been able to depict the kind of code switching that goes on between people who are bilingual, specifically between Spanish and English speakers. And it just really struck to me, and I always will forever remember the way that she just used the language in it and the ability to tell this story that is so fantastical about a situation that is so real right now in the United States regarding immigration, and that still is very relevant. And being able to take that very real story and just transport it into something almost in a whole different light, that you have to see things differently and view different possibilities of what the future could happen. And I found it really enlightening to just open up that world and explore it from a whole different perspective, because I think that's very enlightening, and it could be to anybody who is maybe not familiar with personally a kind of story that is like that. And so I will, and that's why I'm particularly, I'm really fond of House of the Scorpion. Not only that, but it's also a young adult novel that speaks very very intimately with the traumas that come along with everything that of coming into a new world and existing in a whole another world, and discovering piece by piece how different worlds exist and understanding societies. And I think if anything, that's an interesting sociological aspect to investigate.
Thank you. My reco is by Tananarive Due, The Living Blood. And I'm just going to kind of talk about it in broad terms because I don't want to ruin the book for anybody who hasn't read it. But the premise to me was really intriguing. It was about a group of immortals living outside the constraints of time, and how this group chose to interact with the rest of the world, or not interact with them, depending. And so I thought the idea was really interesting. And the way I buy books is I buy a lot of books, and then eventually I'll get to this. So I bought this book actually in 2018, and I probably read it at the end of 2019. So I didn't even remember what the book was actually about when I was reading it. And so I was really into the relationships of the characters, because it's following this one lady's journey whose husband disappeared, because she finds out at the end of the first book. I didn't even know this was book 2. So I really didn't know much about this book when I first read it. And it was just following that the wife's journey as she's trying to figure out what's going on with her husband, and how he's this immortal, and how things happen to her, and what's going on with her, and what happens to her because of that. And I actually, probably when I bought it, thought it was about vampires, but it's kind of the opposite of vampires, just if you can imagine the opposite of vampires. But the way Tanana Reeve goes through and she puts people in these realistic situations. And while I may not always agree with what they did, I totally understand why they would do what they did. And the story just kept me riveted. And it traces back to things in Africa. And I haven't really read a lot of books in which they explore like kind of a rich history of Africa. And a lot of times it might be like in passing with like the slave narrative or like war and things like that. But this is, it takes it a totally different way. And it was just really nice to see Africa portrayed in that light. And some of the places she talked about I had actually visited too. So for me, I really enjoyed this book because first, the story was great, the idea is great, the characters are great, and it deals with like the second largest continent, in which I don't really feel like a lot of books I've seen or read handles. So that was my recommendation. Okay, so now we can discuss or do anything we like at this point.
So Jojo, you mentioned in your book the code switching that goes on in the head of someone who's duolingual, which is interesting to me. I've never really thought about it. Some of my coworkers and I were talking about code switching at work, as far as, you know, if you're being Black and having that switch between how you act with your Black friends and how you act with your non-Black friends, or with your white friends or other coworkers. But I never really thought of it from the point of view of code switching with language. Even though for a while I was traveling to Guatemala, you know, you don't really think of that, you know, does it take, you know, is there a moment, or how does that work in the mind of someone who is fluently bilingual? So it's kind of,
Yeah.
I almost want to read the book just to understand that aspect of it, you know?
No, I'm so glad. It's like, it was just, I remember that this book was just really intriguing to me because for the first time, in my mind, for especially when I was much younger and I learned Spanish first and then I learned English, my mind almost naturally sometimes speaks this way in both English and in Spanish. And so to read a book that almost was written in at certain parts the same way that my mind thought was very strange to me, and also very, like, it was very easy, like, I don't know, like it felt like a glove almost because it just seemed to like match where my mind would like switch between different languages.
Thank you for that.
Did you say that the author herself was not Latino background? Did you say that?
She wasn't,
oh, okay.
which genuinely surprised me. She's from Arizona, and she had several relationships with people that were from Mexico and were dealing with the immigration issue, and she's currently still living there. And so it was really surprising to me about like how she was able to connect so well with a culture that she was not born into, but she was surrounded by. And I think that is an aspect that I think like a lot of people, it's hard to do. And I think it's very commendable that someone can not only find that, but also write about it and dwell.
It's become so controversial lately to even do that. I mean, some books have been preempted just because people were writing about a different culture, and it seems it's not acceptable right now. So I was just intrigued by that fact.
I was too. I remember loving the book so much when I was much younger, but I didn't know much about the author. It's only up until recently that I've been doing a lot more research on the author herself, because I'm the kind of person I focus a lot on the narrative more so than who's necessarily behind it, because to me, if the narrative is pulling forward and it is strong enough for it to stand on its own, does it really matter who wrote it? Which I think could be a different discussion in of itself, but that's the way my mind tends to go with storytelling.
Randall, the book that you were describing, is it a lot of just introspection, or is there a plot too in the book?
Yeah, yeah, there is a plot, and a whole lot of character development of the person he's dealing with, and of course you can read a whole lot into his character, by his narration. Yeah, there's a plot, and it's introspective to an extreme degree. It's what I would call clinical introspection. And I mean, that sounds deadly, but actually it's not, because it just makes you realize how thought really operates. I mean, he gets down into the minutiae of it as he's like, for example, he's in a pub with this guy or something, and he's just and the guy asked him to go to the pub, and the narrator's like, he's speculating why, and then he kind of like, as they talk, he kind of finds out why, and then he responds to what he thinks the guy needs, and it turns out not to be what the guy needs or wants to hear. And so, yeah, and then that scene turns out to be unsatisfactory for both of them, but yeah, it's introspective. That's what you asked, right?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
thank you.
I certainly thought about writing stories that were similar to the ones that you were describing. That collection, like almost like a study of how the thought process works, because that's always been an interest of mine, and I'm glad someone was able to figure that out.
Well, sorry to cut everybody off, but this is all the time that we have. Thank you for sharing your thoughts and your book recommendations and author recommendations with us. We also want to thank everybody for listening.